Hey there, welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about Overland Travel. So I've made videos in the past about hex crawling, and this will tie into that a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more kind of about generally about Overland Travel and how we would use it in the campaign and kind of how to expand your campaign by using it. So let's dig into this and let's see what we got. As usual, I'm using the Moldvay Cook Marsh, so basically BX as my baseline. This is pretty much exactly the same. Well, not exactly. It's pretty much very close to what's in original Dungeons and Dragons. Things obviously change over time, but also what's in OSC. But the one thing that you get with breaking it up into two sets is that you get the basic book and you get the expert book. And in the basic book, the conceit is generally that you're going to be dungeon crawling. You're building up your levels, you're building up your wealth, you're building up your power. Through delving into some, relatively localized dungeon that's safe to get to and out of, and you're going back to a safe haven. When you reach the expert levels, so level 4 basically, the next book, the expert book, the Cook Marsh book, breaks out into overland travel and wilderness adventures. These can be much, much more deadly in the sense that you could encounter huge amounts of very powerful beasts randomly kind of traveling through the woods, or maybe not so random, right? And because of that, you want to be a bit higher level. Now, if you're just jumping into this with OSE, I'm not sure it even says that in OSE. I guess I'd have to look. But so you may just grab a bunch of first level characters and run out in the wilderness. And that's cool. I mean, you can definitely do that. But it will be deadly. Or you could, if you're a DM, you could set yourself up so like, okay, there's a local dungeon or whatever, or dungeons, if you want to do smaller dungeons, around, but the characters have to travel to them. So we're going to do a little bit of overland travel to get there. In any case, that's real basic stuff. I'm talking in this about real overland travel, like traveling distances. So got my little dealio here. Let me just make sure I have my notes. So what we want to establish is, why does the party want to make this overland journey? Perhaps it's because they found a treasure map. Treasure map's awesome. Or they're traveling to a new mega dungeon because they've cleared out this one. Or they're traveling to a locale because there's been some kind of a call to action. There's a dragon or something. Or maybe, they just get bored and they want to travel, right? If there are roads going between these two areas that are fairly safe, that's one thing. If there's wilderness, the characters can travel through it. Now, remember, they could be trailblazers. They could be hired. Let's say that you're in you're in a small like outpost town, and there you want to connect. It's starting to grow, right? Because it's mega dungeon, and now they want to expand. They may actually hire the player characters, or the player characters could be hired as part of a group that is sent to kind of blaze the trail to some other town or to some other city, or to start a new settlement. So there's lots of reasons why. I think the idea of just traveling to travel doesn't really, because it's so dangerous, doesn't necessarily work. So I would definitely think about that as you're setting out. What reasons do the characters have to travel? And it's easy enough to plant treasure maps, rumors, all these other things to get them out into the land. And again, I'm not talking about traveling one day to a dungeon or even maybe 2 days to this like localized tower that you heard a rumor about. I'm talking about traveling. So when we're traveling, right, across large distances, we're going to want to prepare, and we're going to want to be ready for these things. Now, this in itself is kind of a mini game, and again, if you followed anything I do, I like mini games. I can see people going, I don't want to be an accountant. I don't want to track arrows. I don't want to track these things. That's also fun. I mean, if you don't want to play that kind of game, then, don't. Just have them jump to the next spot. But for those that want to, I'm not even saying add realism, but add a different type of adventure to their game, this is what we're going to talk about here. So let me get out my little notes here, and let's go into this and talk. Okay, so number one, as I mentioned, you need to have a reason to travel. If the player characters just randomly go out into the woods looking for stuff locally, again, this is not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the border town that they're on. They've traveled out 4 or 5 miles, and they found that it breaks over into a giant desert. And there's rumors that somewhere in the middle of that desert there is a temple full of gold that nobody's looted because it's very difficult to track the desert. And you've got maybe a scout or some kind of a seer who has identified a route, possibly. or some map carved in stones. They've got this reason they want to travel here. And what we want to consider is how far away it is, how they're going to get there without getting lost, and, how they're going to get back, right? That's the other thing. And when I say we, I mean not just you as Dungeon Master, but also the players, right? The players need to consider, okay, this temple is untouched. Nobody's crossed this desert because it's over a week's travel across a arid landscape where it's hard to track yourself and where, if you run out of water, you could die. Do we want to risk this? And do we have enough gold to finance this trip? And that's the thing, right? We want to do that. You're going to want to hire henchmen. You're going to want to hire maybe pack animals, almost certainly, to get the stuff in and out. You're going to need to be carrying tons of water. You're going to need to carry food, extra supplies. If your sword breaks when you're in the dungeon, you can't just go get another one when you're, a week away. So these are things we want to consider. And again, that part of the game, that resource management part of the game, is fun for some people. And if every player at your table isn't into it, that's still okay as long as some of them are, because this is the kind of thing I would not do at the table. I would not be sitting around at the table and say, okay, let's go through the book and figure out. What I would do is the party themselves should assign a character or a player, whatever you want to do it, to be in charge of that. And let them deal with you. If you want, as DM, you could offer them extra experience points for doing it, or maybe they just want to do it because it's fun. And they should make their list of all the things. Again, you don't need to role play out the shopping. You don't need to role play out, oh, I want to go buy 5 things of oil. Okay, well, the shopkeeper wants to give you, unless they're trying to do something, get something really odd or weird, let them make their list of stuff, tell them how much it's going to be, and they buy it. It's easy as that. Deal with hiring scouts and henchmen in character, in game, like you normally would, and then kind of just move on, right? And I think that part's pretty simple. And again, if the players don't like doing that, but you want to do a journey and you want to have some of this stuff, you could always whip it together yourself and be like, this is the stuff that you need for the journey that they told you to buy, so here it is. But usually there's at least one player that wants to do it. Okay, so let's talk about the journey itself, because I feel like this is the one where you get a lot of questions, right? What we want to do is condense the journey down into a set of vignettes so that it doesn't take up a ton of table time, but it's interesting. And what I will generally do is think about overall the journey, right? How it would be broken up. Let's follow this idea that it's a 2-week journey. We're going to say it's 2 weeks. It's a 2-week journey across an arid desert. They found a map and they have a scout, so they're pretty confident that they're not going to get lost. So what kind of things can we encounter there? Not just monsters, because we want to obviously do wandering monster checks, but also events, sandstorms, the scout, being taken out, which could be a problem, the water supply being messed up, the food going bad, hirelings running off, with some of your gear. Think about these things beyond just we run into a crocodile. I don't know why it'd be a crocodile in the desert, but we run into some kind of monster. And put some stuff out in the desert too that might attract the PCs away from their goal. So they're traveling, they're following the path they're supposed to follow, and they look off and they can see, though, they're supposed to be traveling north, but they can see that, over here to the west, we see what could be the signs of a caravan, or possibly they hear some sounds or whatever. So maybe they'll change their path to go see what that is, or maybe they won't. And again, that's up to the player characters. The other thing that I would do is I would make sure that when they encamp at night, that you let the players have some roleplay opportunity there. I mean, in-character roleplay. So you might want to pick one of if it's multiple nights or whatever, you might want to pick one player to say, okay, tell me, how it's, how it is around the fire that night. You can give a basic thing like, oh, it's been really dry and hot and you guys are running low on water. How do you guys feel? What goes on around the fire as this is happening? Blah, blah, and let the player take it. They're almost never going to say something that's going to destroy if they say something like, well, a dragon flies down and gives us all this money, know your players, right? But, what I'm saying, let them narrate out a little bit what happens. One tip that, I'm sorry, I don't know his last name, but I believe his name is Jason from the Pharaoh Black Dragon podcast talks about a lot, is the idea of setting up the scene by saying, and I use this, is you'd be like, okay, well, you know what? Today was a bad day for you. You feel extra tired. Why? And then let the player roll with that. So that way they already know where they're going, so they don't just have to, because sometimes you can surprise the players, and they're like, "Me? I have to choose." And let them do a little vignette. Let them have a little fun. Don't just like say things at them the whole time. Because if I'm a player and you're talking to me for 15 minutes straight about the desert and the different days and nothing happens except for you narrating to me, that's going to become probably boring for me as a player, to be honest with you. I want to be able to interact with the environment. I want to be able to talk. So you want to give your players opportunities to do that. The other thing that I would do is I would set up your events, whether they be wandering monsters or whatever, and I would have it the further they get from civilization, have the chance increase. So I think that the way that it works in the books of BX and stuff, I'll quickly look at it in a second, but it's like there's a chance in the desert, let's say a 2 and 6 chance per day that you run into an encounter. Instead of that, I would do 2 and 6 the first day, then maybe 3 and 6, then 4 and 6, then 5, or something like that, and have it go up so that it increasingly gets more likely they're going to encounter something. And then once they do, either have it reset or just have no more encounters. Because, again, you don't want to take half your session of them traveling and have no encounter, because that can be boring. So these are things we just want to think of. And again, the journey doesn't have to take that long. If you want them to just find the desert ruin and they've got a scout and they have a map, you can just narrate the whole thing in 2 minutes and be like, okay, well, you had enough supplies, you had a map, so blah, blah, blah. But if it's that easy to find with no issues, how come somebody else hasn't come before? So think about where they're going. If they're going to a place that's been raided before, that the scout's been to, that the scout, the permanent scout the whole time. The scout, the person that's leading them. They if they've been there before, then it shouldn't be that big of a deal, right? But if it is truly an unknown area, make sure that you're using the various rules so that it can be fun. Just don't bog yourself down with a lot of mechanics while you're going. One thing I like to do is when you're allowing players to do their role play at night, you pre-roll the other encounters, so that the next day comes around and then you can just narrate it. You don't have to stop and be like, okay, hold on, and then roll them. Stay ahead a little bit, making notes, narrate it down. You could even do it before the whole thing starts, but the problem with going it too far in advance is that if they change something or they get to go off track, then you might have to mix it up. So, definitely think about how things are going to change. Okay, so we're going to quickly look at the expert book. I think what I want to try to get here is a lot of feedback. See if you guys want more info. Like I could walk this out and like do a sample version of it if that interests you. But if not, then let's just talk about it in general. So let's look at the expert book here. Let me get my thing over here. So this should give me the expert book. Yeah, okay. So again, in the expert book, we're talking about the base town, which I've talked about before, where it's safe, they can hire people. Down here, we've got organize the party. So again, decide where to go, decide what supplies are needed, equip and outfit the party, establish a marching order, as they're traveling. And of course, they have their example down here. They have the list of things they're going to buy, like their horses and such. And basically, again, some players will really like that. They'll like being the person that makes that, the quartermaster, if you will. And, sometimes it's worthwhile to give extra experience points for that. What I will say, too, is remember that when you're traveling in the wilderness like this, a turn generally is a day. So, again, you don't have to make the day drag by like, oh, I'm going to check 4 or 5. In fact, I think it's, and I'm not throwing shade at any game, but I think it's basic fantasy RPG that makes you check like every 6 hours from wandering monsters when you're a wilderness travel. That's way too much. Once per day, twice max is going to be plenty, I think, for most things to not make it exhausting. Unless you're doing, you're like clearing an area. I mean, if you're like in a wilderness looking to fight monsters, that's one thing. But if you're actually just trying to get someplace, don't bog down the whole thing with tons and tons of combats and stuff. It just isn't necessary. And this is doubly true, if not triply true, in games like 5th edition, where you heal so well every night that you're just literally going to have a combat and then they're going to be fine. In an older game like BX, where you can't even heal when you're on the move, having that combat's going to be a major thing. So if somebody gets hurt, unless they've got a cleric of a high enough level, which if you're 4th level, you probably have a cleric, or something other means, they're not going to heal at all while they're traveling. So these are things to consider. Okay, so again, any travel is going to be considered a day. Let me jump over here. Let's see, traveling in the wilderness. I think this is the area here. Okay, so travel in the wilderness. We've got our chances here of being lost that we can use. It's usually a good idea when you're doing these kind of travels to make your hex map or whatever, and then give the players like a blank hex and let them track where they're going. That way they can, if they get lost, they don't know it, obviously. If they say, oh, we're going to travel north, and they roll and they get lost, you'll know on your map that they veered off, but they'll still be drawing a straight line. This is, it's a little tricky, but this way you kind of can figure out exactly where they are. And when they don't end up where they're supposed to be, they'll figure it out, or they'll figure it out over time. Yeah. So basically, they've got an example here. Again, this is in the expert book. This is page X56. If you've got a guide, I kept getting Scout, but if you have a guide, which is what I was talking about, you're going to not get lost usually. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Or if you have a map, you shouldn't be a problem. But in my example with the desert, there's a 50% chance every day that you might veer off. Because think about it, the desert is just this big open place. If you just start moving in the wrong direction, you're going to be lost. So it'll be good to have a guide when you do those kind of things. Now they do have here, this is another thing I want to address, is the wandering monsters. So yeah, here we go. When traveling in the wilderness, the chance character will encounter creatures as they travel. The DM should decide how often the encounter checks are made. Encounters usually checked once per day, but the DM may include planned encounters and may additional checks appropriate. No more than 3 or 4 encounter checks should be made per day. So 3 or 4 is maybe where Basic Fantasy got it from, but oh god, no, once per day is generally going to be enough, in my opinion, for this. Unless you're going out to fight monsters. If you're just like, we're going out to this area to slay all the monsters in it so we can clear it to build our castle, that's different. If you're traveling, minimize that, right? And again, once one happens during the journey, I probably would then just not have it happen again unless you really feel like it's a good idea to do it. Again, in our desert, we're hitting an encounter on a 5 or a 6 on a d6. So maybe the first day you do 5 or 6, maybe the second day 5 or 6, or what you might do is like in the middle of the journey, make it more likely because you're in the middle of nowhere, right? And then we've got these tables, and this is one of those areas where I see a lot of conversation back and forth and criticism as you look at this thing and you're just like, but hold on, my party's low level, and I rolled desert, I rolled a 6, that's a dragon. Okay, well, again, not everything you encounter has to be hostile, nor does it need to be right on top of you, nor do you need to roll surprise if it's not something that can happen. One of the things about surprise, and I think people don't follow that, is surprise and reaction rolls. You only roll them when you think it's necessary. That is, you can say, there's a dragon flying around, and it is going to be not surprise you because it's going to be far away or whatever. And then you can roll a distance when it's sighted, and then you can roll your reaction or not. You can automatically have it be hostile, but it might be hostile just to ward you away, right? It might scatter the group and make them run. Now everybody's lost, and you've lost some of your supplies. It doesn't have to breath weapon the party and kill them. You can have them do different things. So, these are our tables, which I think are great, although, when possible, we've talked about this before as well, we really want to create our own wandering monster list. It's not usually that big of a deal to sit down, look at the list they have here and go, okay, well, for me, I'm not a big fan of having dragons in my deserts. I don't think any men will be out there, because if there were, that wouldn't make any sense. Why are there men out there? We've got, nobody's discovered this place before. So I'm going to stick with, more undead people that maybe people from a caravan that got lost and they died there, and maybe some desert type animals, and you can just make your own list. That's easy enough to do, right? And again, add things to the list like sandstorms and things that will throw people off, or even things that'll just mess with the party, maybe like a djinn could be out there, right? Or in the desert just whipping things up and making people get lost. Because that can be just as deadly, if not monsters, and it creates this situation where the players have to do something different than pull their swords out and attack. So make the travel interesting in that way. Now, the thing that I think a lot of people miss too, which is, and admittedly I don't use it that much, but I think it's really fun when you want to, is that you can have these situations where they encounter castles, right? Because in the original game, they basically, in the wilderness, you would just run into random castles. And there's rules here for who might be in this castle, if they'll, invite you in, if they'll become hostile, if they'll make you have a joust with them. It's really fun. And it's a cool way to kind of add in kind of a real bizarre fairy tale fantasy element to your travel. If you just are traveling through this desert and all of a sudden there's a tower of a magic user, that's pretty cool. It's weird. And maybe the tower only appears at night, or under a certain, type of constellation, or when the moon is full, right? So nobody's seen this tower before, but now all of a sudden you see it. So you can add these things in, and it adds a bit of mystery, a little fantasy to your travel, makes the travel more interesting. But, and I'll kind of finish with this, think about why they're traveling. I'm going to go back to the beginning again. If we are hex crawling, just looking for random stuff, then more encounters might be worthwhile, right? Oftentimes in a hex crawl, and again, I'll put a link to the hex crawl video, you're going to want to have like some kind of major encounter as they cross a hex, possibly, or they're going to encounter the thing that's in the hex, right? Like maybe there's a dungeon there or whatever. But if you're literally just traveling from one spot to another, basically going between adventures, you can still make it fun. And again, it's easy enough to say, you guys travel 2 weeks through the desert and you get to the location. That's 100% fun. However, it can also be really fun to play through it and have this kind of feeling of what's going on. The most important thing I would say is don't let it drag. I think that's where most people think it's boring, because it's like every day you're like, okay, I'm rolling a random monster. Oh, we fought some giant ants. Oh, I rolled a random monster. Okay, we fought some chameleons. Okay, I rolled a random monster. We're fighting a dragon. That's boring usually for a lot of people, me included. What we want to do is mix it up. So make events and add events to your travel. Add things that can mess with the player characters or help them. Maybe they do encounter a caravan going by, and now the caravan's like, they can sell you extra water and stuff because they encounter you or whatever. But then they're like, why are you traveling through the desert? You should really join us. You're going to get lost. What are you even doing out here? And you see some of the maybe unsavory caravan people that could possibly be thieves or whatever, like kind of eyeballing the party, like, why are they traveling in the desert? And next thing you know, you're being tracked, so by some bandits. So there's all kinds of cool ways you can have encounters in the desert or whatever that aren't just directly, oh, we walk into a monster, we fight it. And then once they're there and they do their adventure, now they're on a ticking clock, right? In this case, especially, you go into the desert for 2 weeks to get out there. You bring, let's say, it's 5 weeks worth of food. You really only have, a week to adventure that in that locale. And if it's a decently deep dungeon and people are getting hurt and all these other things are going on, it might really be a time crunch to get everything done. So let me know what you guys think. Do you use travel, or you just drop people where they need to be? How do you deal with it? Let me know if you're interested in waterborne travel too, because there's also a whole section on waterborne travel that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people don't use boats and water and fighting and stuff like that, like pirates, right? So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments below. Let me know any tips you guys have for traveling, or if you have questions, of course. And subscribe if you haven't already. Ring the bell, and I'll see you next time.